What happens when one of the most controversial figures in modern royalty sits down with one of journalism's toughest interviewers? What starts as a carefully orchestrated primetime special quickly spirals into one of the most explosive confrontations ever broadcast on live television. This is the story of how a single question ignited a firestorm that nobody, not the producers, not the network executives, and certainly not the millions watching at home, saw coming. Before we dive into what went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about all of this. Trust me, you're going to want to share your thoughts after hearing what happened in that studio. The CNN studios in New York were buzzing with an energy that veteran staff members said they hadn't felt in years. Meghan Markle was scheduled for what was being billed as an intimate, wide-ranging conversation with Anderson Cooper. The promotional materials promised revelations, depth, and the kind of candid discussion that had become increasingly rare in an age of carefully managed public images. What nobody anticipated was just how candid things were about to become. Anderson Cooper sat in his chair, his notes perfectly arranged on the small table beside him. Across from him, separated by maybe 6 feet of carefully lit studio space, Meghan Markle settled into her seat. She was dressed impeccably, every detail of her appearance calculated for maximum impact. The cameras were rolling, the control room was locked in, and Anderson began with what seemed like a straightforward opening. "Thank you for being here," Anderson said, his voice carrying that distinctive blend of authority and approachability that had made him a household name. "I want to start by asking you something that I think a lot of people are curious about. You've spoken extensively about your experiences, about the challenges you faced, about feeling unprotected. But there are people who look at the platform you've been given, the opportunities you've had since stepping back from royal duties, and they wonder if there's a disconnect between the narrative of victimhood and the reality of your current position. How do you respond to that?" The question hung in the air for a moment. In the control room, producers exchanged glances. This was going to be interesting. Meghan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I think that's an incredibly loaded question, Anderson," she replied, her voice measured, but with an edge that hadn't been there seconds before. "The word victimhood is fascinating coming from you. I've never claimed to be a victim. I've shared my truth, my experience. There's a difference between being a victim and being victimized. Surely you, as a journalist, understand that distinction." Anderson nodded slowly, not backing down an inch. "I do understand that distinction, but I'm asking because the criticism isn't coming from nowhere. You've signed multi-million-dollar deals, you've done high-profile interviews, you've maintained a very public presence. Some people see that, and they question whether someone who has genuinely been harmed would continue to court the very attention that allegedly caused that harm in the first place. So what you're saying," Meghan interrupted, leaning forward slightly, "is that because I haven't disappeared into obscurity? Because I haven't allowed myself to be silenced? That somehow invalidates what I went through?" "That's a fascinating take, Anderson. Really fascinating." The temperature in the room was rising. Anderson Cooper, to his credit, didn't flinch. "I'm not saying it invalidates anything. I'm asking you to help people understand, because from the outside looking in, it appears contradictory. You speak about wanting privacy while doing interviews. You talk about the pain caused by media scrutiny while actively engaging with that same media. I'm giving you the opportunity to explain that to people who are genuinely confused by it." Meghan's laugh was sharp, almost bitter. "You're giving me the opportunity. How generous of you. Let me ask you something, Anderson. When you came out publicly, when you shared your story, did anyone tell you that you were seeking attention? Did anyone suggest that by continuing to work in television, by maintaining your public profile, you were being hypocritical about wanting to live authentically?" The comparison landed like a bomb. The control room went silent. Anderson's expression hardened. "That's completely different," he said, his voice level but firm. "And I think you know that. Coming out about my sexuality was about living honestly. It wasn't accompanied by accusations against institutions. It wasn't part of a larger narrative about being mistreated. And frankly, using my personal life as a deflection from the questions I'm asking you is beneath both of us." "Is it though?" Meghan shot back. "Or is it just that you're uncomfortable being on the other side of scrutiny for once? You sit in that chair every night, and you ask people difficult questions. You push them, you corner them. But the moment someone pushes back, the moment someone challenges your premise, suddenly that's deflection. That's not journalism, Anderson. That's interrogation." Anderson set down his notes. This was no longer following any script. I push people because that's my job. I ask difficult questions because easy questions don't get to the truth. And right now, I'm asking you a question that millions of people want answered. Not because I'm trying to trap you, but because there's a genuine disconnect that you haven't adequately addressed. You can call it interrogation if you want, but I call it holding public figures accountable. Accountable, Meghan repeated, her voice rising slightly. Accountable for what, exactly? For leaving a situation that was damaging my mental health. For trying to build a life on my own terms. For speaking up when I saw racism and institutional cruelty. What exactly am I being held accountable for, Anderson? Because I'd really love to know. For consistency, Anderson replied without missing a beat. For the gap between what you say and what you do. You signed a deal with a streaming platform and then produced content that was directly about the very institution. You claimed you wanted distance from. You gave an interview that was watched by tens of millions of people and then talked about wanting privacy. You've positioned yourself as someone who was silenced while simultaneously having one of the loudest voices in media. That's what I'm asking about. That's what people want to understand. Meghan stood up, not dramatically, not storming off, but deliberately. She removed the small microphone clipped to her clothing and set it carefully on her chair. I think we're done here, she said quietly. Anderson remained seated, his expression unreadable. We're 20 minutes into a scheduled hour-long interview. Then I guess your producers are going to have to fill the remaining 40 minutes with something else, Meghan replied. Because I didn't come here to be ambushed. I came here thinking we were going to have a real conversation. But this isn't a conversation. Anderson, this is you trying to play gotcha with someone's lived experience. Asking tough questions isn't an ambush, Anderson said, his voice steady. And if you can't handle being questioned about the very public statements you've made and the very public actions you've taken, then maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews at all. The words hung in the air like a challenge. In the control room, someone whispered into Anderson's earpiece, but he didn't acknowledge it. His eyes were locked on Meghan. Maybe you're right, Meghan said after a long pause. Maybe I shouldn't be doing interviews, especially not with people who have already made up their minds about me before I've even sat down. You know what the real problem is, Anderson? It's not that I'm inconsistent. It's that I don't fit into the neat little box that people like you need me to fit into. I'm either supposed to be the wronged princess who suffers in silence, or I'm the calculated opportunist who's playing the victim. There's no room in your narrative for the possibility that I'm just a person who went through something difficult and is trying to figure out how to move forward. Anderson stood up now facing her across the space that suddenly felt much wider than 6 feet. That's not fair, and you know it. I've given you every opportunity to explain yourself, to make your case. But instead of engaging with the substance of what I'm asking, you're attacking me personally and suggesting that I'm biased. If anyone has made up their mind here, I think it might be you. About me. You want substance. Meghan's voice was sharp now, all pretense of media-trained politeness gone. Here's some substance for you. Every single decision I've made since leaving has been criticized. Every interview, every project, every statement. If I stay silent, I'm letting them win. If I speak up, I'm attention-seeking. If I try to move on and build something new, I'm exploiting my past. There is literally no version of this where I come out ahead in the court of public opinion, and people like you make sure of that. People like me, Anderson repeated. You mean journalists? I mean people who profit from controversy, who build their careers on tearing others down under the guise of asking tough questions. The accusation landed hard. Anderson's jaw tightened. That's a hell of a thing to say to someone who has spent decades reporting from war zones, covering humanitarian crises, and holding the powerful accountable. I don't profit from controversy, Meghan. I report the news. And right now, you are the news. You made yourself the news. And if you can't handle the scrutiny that comes with that, then that's something you need to reckon with, not project onto me. I made myself the news. Meghan's voice was incredulous now. I was hounded by tabloids from the moment my relationship became public. I was subjected to racist commentary, to invasive coverage, to lies and manipulation. I didn't make myself the news, Anderson. I was made into news whether I wanted it or not. And when I tried to defend myself, when I tried to set the record straight, that became news to. So forgive me if I'm skeptical about your noble journalistic mission here. Anderson took a step closer, not aggressively, but with the kind of deliberate movement that signaled he wasn't backing down. You're absolutely right that you were subjected to terrible treatment. I'm not disputing that. The racist coverage was inexcusable. The invasion of privacy was wrong, but that doesn't mean you get to avoid legitimate questions about your choices since then. Those two things can both be true at the same time. Legitimate questions, Meghan said, shaking her head. You keep using that word. But what you're really doing is repeating tabloid talking points and dressing them up as journalism. The idea that I'm somehow hypocritical for not disappearing, for not just taking the abuse and staying quiet, that's not a legitimate question, Anderson. That's victim blaming with better lighting. Now, you're using the word victim, Anderson pointed out. A minute ago, you said you weren't claiming to be one. I said I wasn't claiming victim. There's a difference. I was victimized by a racist press and an institution that refused to protect me. That's a fact. But I'm not going to let that define me or silence me. And if you can't understand the distinction there, then this conversation was doomed from the start. In the control room, producers were frantically discussing whether to cut to commercial, whether to end this, whether to let it play out. The decision was made to keep rolling. This was television gold, even if it was rapidly becoming a disaster. Anderson crossed his arms. Let me ask you something else then. You've talked about the institution, about the lack of protection, but you've been very careful about who you name, who you blame. You've made sweeping statements about the system while benefiting from the speculation about specific individuals. Don't you think that's unfair? To cast aspersions without being specific enough for anyone to actually defend themselves. Meghan's eyes flashed. Unfair? You want to talk about unfair? I was told explicitly that if I named names, if I got specific, I would be sued into oblivion. I would face legal action that would destroy me financially and personally. So I spoke in general terms because those were the only terms I was allowed to use without facing retaliation. And now you're telling me that's unfair? That I should have just sacrificed myself completely to satisfy people's curiosity? I'm saying that if you're going to make accusations, even implied ones, people deserve to know who and what you're actually talking about. Otherwise, it's just innuendo, and innuendo destroys reputations just as effectively as direct accusations. Maybe more so because there's no way to definitively refute it. People's reputations, Meghan laughed bitterly. That's what you're worried about? What about my reputation? What about the fact that I've been called everything from a social climber to a manipulator to a liar? Where was this concern for fairness and specificity when I was being torn apart in the media? Anderson's voice remained calm, which somehow made his words cut deeper. You're conflating tabloid coverage with what I'm doing right now. I'm not a tabloid, Meghan. I'm asking you direct questions about your public statements and actions. If you can't see the difference, or if you won't see the difference, then yes, maybe this interview was a mistake. Finally, something we agree on, Meghan said. She looked around for her bag, clearly preparing to leave. Before you go, Anderson said, let me ask you one more thing. Do you think any of this has been worth it? The interviews, the deals, the projects, all of it. Has it actually made your life better, or has it just traded one kind of scrutiny for another? Meghan stopped. For the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed genuinely caught off guard by the question. That's a complicated question. I have time for a complicated answer. She turned back to face him fully. Some days I think it has been worth it. I think about the people who've reached out to say that hearing my story helped them, that it made them feel less alone. I think about the conversations that have started about mental health, about racism in institutions, about the cost of public life. Those things matter. Those things are real. And other days, Anderson prompted, other days I wonder if I just made everything worse. If I should have just stayed quiet, stayed in place, played the role I was supposed to play. Because at least then, the only person suffering was me. Now, it feels like everyone is suffering. Everyone is angry. Everyone has an opinion. And nothing has actually changed, except that more people hate me. The honesty of the response seemed to shift something in the room. Anderson's posture softened slightly. That's the most real thing you've said since you sat down. Well, don't get used to it, Meghan replied, but there was less venom in her voice now. Because apparently being real just gives people like you more ammunition. It's not ammunition if it's the truth, Anderson said, and maybe that's the problem. Maybe people are frustrated because they feel like they're not getting the truth from you. They're getting a version of events, a narrative, but not necessarily the whole picture. Nobody gets the whole picture, Anderson. Not from me, not from you, not from anyone. We all curate what we share. We all decide what's too personal, what's too painful, what's too complicated to explain. You do it too, whether you admit it or not. I do, Anderson acknowledged. But I'm not the one doing tell-all interviews and then complaining about privacy. I'm not the one signing production deals and then acting surprised when people want to know what I'm producing. There's a level of self-awareness that seems to be missing here. Meghan's defenses went back up immediately. Self-awareness. You think I'm not aware of every single contradiction? Every single criticism? Every single way that my choices can be picked apart and analyzed? I'm drowning in self-awareness, Anderson. What I'm lacking is grace from people who seem determined to misunderstand me. Or maybe they understand you perfectly, and that's what bothers you. The words were quiet, but devastating. Meghan stared at him for a long moment. You know what I think? She said finally. I think you invited me here because you knew this would happen. You knew that if you pushed hard enough, if you questioned everything, if you made me feel defensive and attacked, that I would react. And that reaction would be the story. Not anything I actually came here to discuss, not any nuance or complexity, just the conflict, just the drama. That's all anyone wants anymore. Anderson shook his head. I invited you here because you're newsworthy and because I thought you deserved a platform to speak. I asked tough questions because that's literally my job. If you can't distinguish between a journalist doing their job and someone setting you up, then that says more about where you're at mentally and emotionally than it does about my intentions. Where I'm at mentally and emotionally, Meghan repeated slowly. That's interesting phrasing. Are you suggesting I'm not stable enough for this conversation? I'm suggesting that you seem to interpret every question as an attack, every bit of pushback as persecution. And that's concerning, not because it makes you look bad, but because it suggests you might not be in a place where doing these kinds of interviews is actually healthy for you. The words hung between them, and for a moment it seemed like Meghan might actually consider them. But then her expression hardened again. Don't pretend you're concerned about my well-being, Anderson. This isn't therapy. This isn't a wellness check. This is you doing exactly what everyone else does, which is find a polite way to suggest I'm crazy, I'm unstable, I'm too emotional to be taken seriously. That is not what I said. It's what you implied. It's what everyone implies. When a woman, especially a woman of color, stands up for herself, when she refuses to be quiet, when she pushes back, suddenly there are questions about her mental state, about whether she's being rational, about whether she can handle the pressure. It's a tale as old as time, and I'm frankly disappointed that you're using that playbook. Anderson's frustration was starting to show now. You're putting words in my mouth and intentions in my head that aren't there. I asked you a question about consistency. You've turned this into a referendum on sexism, racism, and my character. At some point, you have to take responsibility for how you're choosing to engage here. Responsibility, Meghan said. There's that word again. I've taken responsibility for every decision I've made. I've owned my choices. What I won't take responsibility for is other people's reactions to those choices. I won't take responsibility for the fact that some people were always going to hate me no matter what I did. I won't take responsibility for a system that was broken long before I came into it, but you will take money to talk about that system. You will take opportunities that come from being associated with that system. You can't have it both ways, Meghan. You can't be both the victim of the institution and the beneficiary of your connection to it. Meghan's voice rose. Why can't both things be true? I was harmed by my association with that institution. I also have name recognition because of it. Those facts don't cancel each other out. I'm allowed to acknowledge the damage while also using whatever platform I have to try to make something positive from it. That's not hypocrisy, Anderson. That's survival. It's also profitable, Anderson countered, and I think that's what people struggle with. The idea that your pain has become a commodity, that your trauma is a brand. The accusation was perhaps the most direct one yet. Meghan's face flushed. How dare you, she said, her voice shaking now. How dare you reduce what I went through to a brand, to a commodity? Do you have any idea what it's like to have suicidal thoughts and have nobody take you seriously? To beg for help and be told it would be bad for the image? To watch the person you love suffer because of their association with you and feel completely powerless to stop it. I don't, Anderson said quietly, and I'm not trying to minimize that pain. I believe that you suffered. I believe that you went through something traumatic. What I'm questioning is what you've chosen to do with that experience since then. I've chosen to survive, Meghan shot back. I've chosen to build a life. I've chosen to speak up so that maybe someone else won't have to go through what I went through. If that bothers people, if that seems calculated or opportunistic, then so be it. I'm not going to apologize for refusing to disappear. Nobody's asking you to disappear. They're asking you to be consistent. To be honest, to acknowledge the contradictions in your narrative instead of deflecting every time someone points them out. There are no contradictions, Meghan insisted. There's only people like you who are determined to find them. Anderson stepped back, his expression unreadable. Then help me understand something. You said earlier that you spoke in general terms because you were afraid of legal action. But you've also said in other interviews that you were silenced, that you weren't allowed to speak. Which is it? Were you afraid of the consequences of speaking, or were you literally prevented from speaking? Because those are two very different things. Meghan's eyes narrowed. You're twisting my words. I'm quoting them back to you. If they sound twisted, maybe that's because the story keeps changing depending on who you're talking to and what point you're trying to make. The story hasn't changed, Meghan said, her voice tight. The context changes. The audience changes. The way I explain things might change. But the fundamental truth of what I experienced hasn't changed at all. So when you say you were silenced, what you really mean is you chose not to speak because you were worried about the consequences. Is there a difference, Anderson? If the consequences are severe enough, if the threat is real enough, then being afraid to speak is the same as being silenced. The end result is the same. My voice was taken away. Anderson shook his head slowly. Your voice wasn't taken away. You chose to stay quiet, which is your right, and then you chose to speak later, which is also your right. But framing it as silencing, as if you had no agency in the matter, that's where people feel manipulated. Manipulated, Meghan repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. You know what's actually manipulative? This entire interview. You brought me here under false pretenses. You said this would be a conversation, but it's been an interrogation from the moment I sat down. And now you have the audacity to accuse me of manipulation. I didn't bring you here under false pretenses. Your team negotiated this interview. They knew my reputation. They knew how I conduct interviews. If you expected softball questions and sympathetic nodding, then your team did you a disservice by booking you here. My team, Meghan said with a bitter laugh. You think I'm some puppet being controlled by handlers. I made the decision to come here. I thought you were someone who would actually listen, who would try to understand instead of just playing gotcha. I was wrong. I have listened, Anderson said, his patience clearly wearing thin. I've listened to you deflect. I've listened to you play the victim. I've listened to you attack me personally instead of engaging with the substance of what I'm asking. What I haven't heard is a straight answer to a straight question. Meghan grabbed her bag, her movements sharp and deliberate. Then, I guess you're not going to get one. Because I'm done with this. Of course you are, Anderson said, and there was something in his tone, a note of finality. Because that's what you do, isn't it? When the questions get too hard, when someone doesn't just accept your version of events without question, you leave. You walk away. You call it self-preservation, but maybe it's just an inability to be challenged. Meghan stopped at the edge of the set, turning back one last time. You think you know me, Anderson. You think this hour, this hostile interview, gives you some insight into who I am. You don't know anything. You don't know what it costs to smile when you're dying inside. You don't know what it's like to be scrutinized and judged for every breath you take. You sit here in your comfortable chair with your comfortable life, and you judge me for not performing my trauma the way you think I should. Well, I'm sorry I'm not the perfect victim for you. I'm sorry I didn't just suffer quietly and disappear when it was convenient for everyone else. I never asked you to be a perfect victim, Anderson said, standing to face her one final time. I asked you to be honest. There's a difference. The silence that followed was deafening. In the control room, someone finally made the call. Cut to commercial. Cut now. But before they could, Meghan delivered her final words, looking directly into the camera rather than at Anderson. To everyone watching, this is what happens when you try to speak your truth. This is what happens when you refuse to play by rules that were designed to keep you quiet. They invite you in, they act like they want to hear from you, and then they do everything they can to tear you down. I hope you're all taking notes, because this is exactly what I've been talking about all along. She walked off the set. Anderson stood there for a moment, then turned to the camera himself. "We'll be right back," he said, his voice steady despite everything that had just happened. The camera cut away. Behind the scenes, chaos erupted. Producers were screaming into headsets. Network executives were being called. Social media was already exploding with clips and commentary. What was supposed to be a major interview had turned into something else entirely. A confrontation that would be dissected and debated for days, weeks, months to come. Anderson Cooper removed his own microphone, his expression thoughtful. Whether he felt vindicated or concerned about how the interview had unraveled was impossible to tell. He'd done his job, asked the questions that needed asking. Whether he'd gotten the answers was another matter entirely. The CNN set, moments before, filled with tension and raised voices, now sat empty. The lights still blazed, the cameras still pointed at vacant chairs. Somewhere in the building, Meghan Markle was likely in a car already, heading away from what would surely become one of the most talked-about interview disasters in recent memory. The question everyone would be asking wasn't what was said, though that would be analyzed endlessly. The real question was what it all meant. Had Anderson Cooper crossed the line, or had he simply done what journalists are supposed to do? Had Meghan Markle been ambushed, or had she been unable to handle legitimate scrutiny? There would be no consensus, no clear answer. Just two people, two perspectives, and a conversation that had spiraled so far out of control that it had to end before it could really begin. What do you think happened in that studio? Was Anderson Cooper too aggressive with his questioning? Or was Meghan Markle unable to handle being challenged? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this don't come around every day. Let me know your thoughts on who is in the right here.